Hello everyone, welcome to the iNtaka podcast, and today with me is Dr. Caris Craig. Briefly about Dr. Caris Craig, she's a faculty member at the Oscott Hall Law School, York University in Toronto, Canada. She is also the Associate Dean for the Research and Institutional Relations, and she is the Director of Law and Technology Program, the IP Oscott. She is also an Academic Director of the Professional LLM program in IP and editor-in-chief of the Oscott Hall Law Journal. She teaches and researches in areas of copyright law, trademark law, and technology, and feminist legal theory. So, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. So before we dive into this interesting area, the fascinating area of AI and copyright, can you please outline the spark for me? When did this start? How were you ignited to fall into this kind of interesting field?
Sure. So I've been teaching copyright law for 20 years or so at this point. So when I started, the most interesting thing that was happening in copyright law was Napster, and your face was completely blank there. Napster, peer-to-peer file sharing, music, there was this whole new thing called the internet, and we were all very excited and worried about what it would do for copyright law, for culture and the arts, for musicians and artists, and what the whole culture of sharing online was going to mean, and the way in which it was going to change the systems that we had in place for sort of traditional publishing, traditional entertainment and cultural industries in the 1990s. And so it was a time when everything was new and the technology was really making us rethink old concepts. And so when I started thinking about copyright law, it was mostly from a sort of theoretical perspective, thinking about whether the old concepts and ways of understanding private ownership and control and contracting around intellectual properties, whether that was going to make sense in the digital era, whether that was going to make sense when we moved into an online environment. And then, we carried on struggling with what that meant, and with law reform, trying to deal with copyright online for the next 10, 15, 20 years. But, we'd reached a point where we understood that the shift to digital hadn't been quite as important for copyright law in its evolution. That copyright law kind of stayed the same and just sort of migrated online, but took shape controlling intellectual properties in the online environment the way it had previously. So it's a long way of saying that there was a new technological shift, and this is the next, I think, paradigm-changing technology that we're seeing with the emergence of artificial intelligence, and it's kind of representing all of the same questions that we had at the sort of outset of the internet age, but new questions. And so trying to grapple with this relationship between law and technology, and between copyright industries in new technological environments, that's something I've always been interested in, and so that's what I continue to do.
Wonderful. 20 years, that's more than 2 decades.
Yes.
I don't know what I was doing back then, but it's very interesting. And then now, so the most interesting part, of course, with this whole AI thing, is the issue of authorship and ownership. But before we dive into ownership, I would like to ask a question. Do you think that can AI itself be the author? Can we say that AI, has authored a paper which can be copyrightable, or in work which someone can copyright?
So my answer to that is just a clear and categorical no, that an AI itself cannot be an author. And in fact, that was where I kind of started my thinking on artificial intelligence and copyright, was with the idea I would just make this one point, and this was the thing that interested me about artificial intelligence, that an AI cannot be an author. And that whatever else we decide to do with copyright law and policy, we must not make that mistake, right? That's the thing we have to get right, and recognize that authorship, the thing that we have copyright to encourage, that is not what the AI is doing. Right? And so that was the first paper that I wrote in this area, was with Ian Kerr. He was a Canada Research Chair in innovation law at the University of Ottawa. And he actually had been studying artificial intelligence for for as long as I've been studying copyright law. Basically, he'd been interested in robots in the law, and nobody thought that robots in the law was really an area, but he kept insisting, no, this is really important. And he was doing all facets of it, from privacy to the use of automated weapons in war. And he was interested in this question as well about sort of the agency that we tend to attribute to robots. The sort of assumption we make when we anthropomorphize them, when we imagine that they're sort of autonomous and therefore fail to recognize the role that humans are playing in the creation and deployment of robots and AI. And so he and I this is really maybe an answer to your first question about why did I start thinking about this. I felt at the time that AI was new, but we didn't really know what it was going to do, but it didn't necessarily present any new questions for us in terms of applying the old or the existing law. But I was getting increasingly frustrated with people just using the term AI authorship or AI authors, or talking about AI as creators. And the whole time I was thinking, well, that's not what they are. And if we make that mistake, then the path for copyright is clear, right? Like at that point, then copyright will be attaching to everything that AI generates, and then we're going to have a completely different kind of cultural environment than we would have if we made the opposite decision and refused to attach copyright to anything that AI generated. And so it seemed to me that that was just one critical intervention that would clarify that basic point. And so our argument in that paper, it's called The Death of the AI Author. And basically, we're riffing on the death of the author and, Roland Barthes and theories of authorship to claim really that people are romanticizing not just authorship, but they're romanticizing robots when they imagine that robots can be authors.
Oh, thank you so much for that interesting insight. But I have a follow-up question. Do you think that we can cure this death of AI authorship if we extend legal personhood to AI? I know there are reports that Saudi Arabia did it. Questions, of course, are around that. But what are your thoughts? Do you think we can cure this, or it remains a firm no, that we should recognize them as authors?
Could we? Sure. We can do anything. It's just the law, right? We make it up. So legal personhood as well is just a legal fiction. So we can create legal fictions to solve problems in law. But the reason why I'm more hesitant is because I don't think it's a cure, because I don't think it's a problem that the AI is not an author. I think that's the answer. I think that's the right outcome. And so I I know that there's a lot of pressure on policymakers and lawmakers around the world to kind of fill that gap, right? We think, how is it possible that these works are being generated and nobody owns them? And so there's a lot of pressure to use concepts of legal personhood to, or even just more simply a basic legal fiction like the work for hire doctrine in the US, works made in the course of employment, and just transfer that over and say, okay, we're going to deem the AI to be an author. And we're going to then use concepts of legal personhood or just other legal fictions to extend the AI ownership of the works. Now, of course, the AI is not going to own anything, right? Because someone's going to be doing something on behalf of an AI. So then it's really a battle. Who's going to win? Like, who are the interests who want to control the works that the AI generates? Because that's where the pressure is going to come from to use legal fictions like personhood or the work for hire doctrine to extend copyright to things that I think ought not to be protected.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I think it leads me to my next question. You raised the point that the works that are made by AI, AI cannot own them. Of course, leaving the people in charge, right? Like in South Africa, there's this law that whoever did put the arrangements for the computer to do whatever, right, is the one then who owns. So my understanding now is, of course, with AI, it involves two parties now. The programming guys, and then of course the end user. So who should own this product? And if, like you said, of course, the work for hire and taking AI that way, do you think that it should be the programmer or the programming company or the end user who does put prompts in for that AI then to come up with something?
Okay, so my baseline going in is I think that because I think the AI works are not authored works, I think the AI works ought not to be protected by copyright. And if they're not protected by copyright, then the answer is nobody. And so my first answer is to say, I think nobody, if we're talking about a work that's purely AI generated and based upon simple prompts, I think the answer is that nobody owns the work that's generated, that it belongs in the public domain. And I think it's important for us to recognize that that's probably a good thing. Like, things being in the public domain is not a problem. It doesn't mean they don't have value. It doesn't mean that we don't appreciate that they've been made. It means that they freely circulate in the public domain, but they're not commoditized. They're not exchanged for value in the marketplace. You don't need permission to use them. And I think that's fine. I do think things get a little bit more complicated when you start seeing sort of extensive iterative inputs, complex prompts where someone is really working with an AI tool in a sort of back and forth and playing with and manipulating the images, let's say, that they're getting back from the AI tool, and then either working with what they get back or selecting between many different possible options and making choices and then building upon that. At that point, it's hard to say this is not a work of authorship, right? At that point, what you see is that kind of creative process, original selection and arrangement, some skill and judgment going into that process by the user, by the person who's using the AI tool and working with the outputs and working with the prompts as inputs until they get something that meets their sort of vision for what they wanted to achieve, right? And so if that process can ever amount to authorship, to original authorship, and I think that it probably can, then that's the only person that I could point to and say, well, there's an author, right? There's someone that meets our originality standards, and that's what we understand authorship to be, not creation de novo out of nothing, but working with a tool and creating something through this sort of iterative process. And in that case, of course, it's the user that's the author. And so that would be the person who should be the owner of the work, but only those aspects or elements of the work to which they could point and say, that is the result of my skill and judgment or my original expression, and not something that was merely generated by the AI.
Impressive. Thank you so much. Yeah, in South Africa, there is this a view that there should be an exercise, of course, of skill and judgment, like you said, and it must not be purely mechanical action, like you said, just putting in prompts. But when someone builds up something, then of course they can, to some extent, satisfy the requirement of originality. But my next question that perhaps you can ponder around is, what are the consequences of saying, the works that are generated by AI, or for example, the AI outputs must fall in the public domain? Of course, you mentioned about how good it is, that things are available in the public domain. But for example, for innovation reasons, is it, what do you think subjectively are some of the consequences of that? Yes.
I mean, that's a very good question. And I think to some extent, it remains to be seen, as so much does here. Like, we have a sense that this is paradigm shifting. We have a sense that this is going to change quite radically our cultural environment, the way that we produce works, the way that they circulate. So I think the answer really is, I don't know. But there are some things that seem clear. First of all, the capacity of AI tools to generate vast numbers of products almost instantaneously. It's so fast and at such scale that there is, I think, a real concern, and a legitimate concern, that these generated outputs are going to kind of flood our sort of cultural space, that they will therefore potentially substitute for other kinds of expressions that would traditionally circulate in the marketplace, using copyright law and created by human authors. So there is a danger of this kind of massive sort of surplus of AI-generated artifacts, kind of overwhelming our cultural environment. And I think here, I'm really quite persuaded by a recent intervention by the late Dan Burke in one of his last pieces on this, where he talks about cheap creativity, right? We live in an age of cheap creativity where actually what AI is doing is it's making it easy and cheap for people to create vast numbers of outputs that previously they wouldn't have been able to. And his best guess is that this is actually going to mean that we come to value human creativity and expression all the more so, in a way. There's sort of this glut of machine-generated images and text and music. But I feel, and Ian and I as well argued, that there's just something different about a work that is a human-made work. And the difference is that all of these vehicles of literature, art, drama, theatre, whatever it is, we're expressing ourselves. We are trying to share meanings. Right? We're engaged in a kind of social dialogue. We're imagining an audience and we want to articulate a feeling or persuade them of something so they can see the world the way we do. Whatever that is, it's not something of which a machine is capable. And so I think what that means is we might come to care more from a regulatory perspective, not about trying to control or limit these outputs. I don't think that's possible for a start, but rather thinking about how do we signal to people, to consumers, to audiences, what it is that they're looking at, and how do we recognize the value of the human expressive work as compared to these machine-generated outputs. So that might be things like a renewed attention to maybe certification marks, maybe trademarks and misinformation. We'll be doing more work. So we're actually ensuring that consumers know what it is they're getting, that you actually could choose to make sure that what you're getting is something that's human generated or not. Maybe the market will decide that anyway. If that's what audiences really want, then that will come to be the thing that they're served. But I think there are many different ways in which this is going to play out. We can't possibly know exactly how it's going to work. But I think trying to control and limit the generation of AI outputs is going to be the least helpful intervention that we could make.
Yes, no, thank you so much. I think you raised a very important aspect there. You said, people being able to distinguish between the AI generated and the human kind of, made outputs. For example, I don't know if you do appreciate this, but most people, when they're buying things like bags, they appreciate, handmade bags, as opposed to, of course, the ones that are made by machines. So it's sort of like there's that value in what someone did take their time to make, maybe 2 hours or 3 hours, just crocheting, doing, a nice thing. So I believe that if you can do that, but of course, as you say, the practicality of putting, watermarks, trademarks, all those kind of things might also be quite IF. So I think that's it on authorship and ownership, which then takes me to the other interesting aspect of AI. As AI comes, there are issues, of course, that are being raised from various fields, but the most interesting one in the field of intellectual property is copyright infringement and liability. So when AI creates something, do you think that at the training phase of AI, the amount of data, the vast quality of data which AI ingests should be, considered infringement in a way, or it should be non-infringing process at the training phase of AI?
Okay. Yeah, so this is, I think, increasingly the focus of a lot of lawmakers' attention right now. So, when AI first entered the scene, we were thinking, what is it, and should copyright attach to it? And then along the way, we're like, wait a minute, how does this work? How do we train it? And then you realize, oh yes, it's vast quantities of text and images and data, but things that are protected by intellectual property, protected by copyright. And so, in part, this is a copyright problem because copyright already protects far too much for far too long. But anyway, that's the way it is. So it's true that we're training AI on vast quantities of copyright protected materials, and that if it were to be the case that that cannot be done without the permission of every copyright owner of every individual work that's within a training data set that probably includes millions or billions of works, the copyright could basically be the thing that prevents AI from developing a piece, right? It could be the thing that changes the trajectory of AI development or obstructs it and significantly limits the capacity of AI to be trained and to be deployed and developed. And I think for some people, particularly sort of critics of AI who are very concerned about the rise of AI technologies, that might indeed be the point. Like, that's a good thing. So a lot of people are turning to copyright law saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this is the best or most efficient tool that we actually have that could stop the rise of AI either in its tracks or at least severely restrict the capacity to train and deploy these tools. I don't personally think that's the role of copyright law. I think copyright law would be a very poor and inept regulatory tool for that purpose. And it could be counterproductive to use copyright law in a way that would obstruct the training of AI. And so my own opinion, so from that policy perspective, is that copyright law should not be the thing that's putting up boundaries and fences and preventing AI tools from being adequately trained. Copyright law should not be the thing that's taking, great divots out of the materials that you need, the data sets that you need to train a quality AI tool. And so for that reason, I think we ought not to be regarding the use of materials for AI training purposes as an infringing use. And I think that there are good ways to get there anyway, through the existing doctrine, which is to say, I don't think we even need a specific exception for this. My argument is that the use of copyright protected materials for this purpose is not a copyright use, or it's not a use of the work as a work, because it's not a use of the work as original expression. I was talking before about the meaning that we try to convey with authorship. These works are not being used for their meaning or understood by the machine in that way. They're simply, the data is being pulled out. They're being turned basically into statistics and tokens. And then that information is the thing that trains the machine. And so I actually think that that use is beyond the scope of the legitimate interests of any copyright owner in the first place. So copyright just shouldn't be implicated at all. And then it would be nice to have I think a clear exception in the law that made that, that made that clear, so that we knew the scope of that freedom to train.
Oh, that's a very interesting standpoint. I think it also goes hand in hand with what the Japanese exception right now is talking about. So I was going through the Japanese section. It does state, that as long as it's training, it's being done, But interestingly for them, it's also for commercial and non-commercial use. But at the training phase, you have, the right to train your AI. Of course, some of the challenges that have been voiced out by AI tech giants is that, you cannot trace every copyright holder. There's no metadata attached to a picture or the material or the works which they're getting access to. So I believe that at the training phase, since there's no communication or expression or exploitation of this work, with the public, I believe that then should also be, free, But of course, our viewers and some of the artists, of course, behind the screens, they might not be, happy about this because they want to get something out of this. But so like you said, but, is there something that can be given to these artists as a way of, I don't know, to keep them satisfied? I think you're also aware that the UK right now, it failed. They tried to ensure that there was licensing, and bodies, but then, of course, the negotiation were abandoned as a result of, they cannot track every copyright holder. So is it still your understanding or your belief that it's impractical to get every copyright holder? Therefore, in the training phase, we should say it's non-infringing. and the artist and the authors must not be compensated? Is it still, or there can be something that we can do to alleviate the situation?
So my position is that copyright isn't implicated,
Yes.
and so it flows from that it doesn't make sense to require compensation for use or credit or consent. People are talking about the three
Yes.
C's in this regard. Like, where's the consent? Where's the compensation? Where's the credit for the artists and the creators whose works have been used to train these AI systems? And in particular, I understand that the reason that's asked is relating to the notion that what the systems are producing is potentially substitutable in the market. So I can completely understand the sort of intuition to say, well, my work is being used to train a system without my permission, and that system is then going to produce outputs that will compete with my work. And I've had no say in that. And I understand that seems to be, I think, sort of a basic summary, but where the discourse is amongst many artists and creative communities when they look at the risks posed by artificial intelligence. The argument I'm making is that copyright is not, again, the solution to this. And in part, I think that is because of the sheer impracticality of ever imagining a system that could actually know and track when all the works that a particular person owns have been used in the training of a system, and then adequately or appropriately compensate them for that in a way that makes any significant difference. Which is to say, if we're talking about systems that are trained on millions or billions of works and they're producing outputs that are unprotected and that in themselves have relatively little value, it's hard to imagine that you could create a sort of micro payment licensing scheme or system that would allow for money to flow back to the people who own, and not the authors of, by the way, but it would be the people who own the copyright in the works on which the systems have been trained. And this is where sometimes the copyright collectives sort of step into the picture and say, oh, that would be tricky, but you're lucky because we're here and we can help. And I'm very skeptical about that claim for a number of reasons. I think it's clearly, first of all, often quite self-serving. Like I can see why the copyright collectives would like to collect a lot of money. I'm not persuaded that they would be able to give it out in a way that would actually achieve the kinds of goals that the artists and creators are talking about. Whether that's a living wage or adequate funding coming back to them, compensation for the use of their works that will make up for the substitution that they're experiencing in the cultural marketplace. That's just not, I just don't think that's a feasible response. Right? The payments are going to be so minuscule and the transaction costs are going to be so huge that it's just not a workable system. There are other ideas, right? I mean, Martin Senftleben has a paper out right now, which I find the most persuasive really in this on this front, which is to say, well, what people really want is a sort of wealth redistribution mechanism, right? A way to make sure that artists and creators are being protected in the face of this sort of new technological threat to their livelihoods. And so in that case, taxing, for example, the sources of AI tools or companies that deploy or sell AI models and their uses, like that money could flow back to the arts if we decided that there should be a levy imposed on the use of generative AI or on the providers of generative AI, and then that could be redistributed or put into cultural funds. That to me makes more sense than counting, wait, who owns what, and did we get consent from this person who, I mean, that to me is, it's a fiction.
Let's say AI generates something, and also I know you did say that we cannot copyright this work, right? But can that work, be considered to be copyright, to be infringing copyright? Let's say it's substantially similar to a work that another copyright owner did make at some point. So someone generates something. Do you think there's copyright infringement at the output stage of AI, where prompts are made or where creativity is prompted, by the end user?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think that's possible. And I
Yes.
think that that's probably just sort of deploying the doctrines and principles that we already have to hand, right? So what we ask is whether a work is substantially similar to a copyright protected work. And then that involves asking, the degree to which they resemble one another. Is there a reproduction of a substantial part of the original copyrightable expression? And also, was there access to the original work? So is the similarity that we see in an allegedly infringing copy, is that similarity due to copying? Is it because there was in fact copying? And of course there can't be copying unless there's access to the thing which you're said to have copied. And so I think what this means is that simply applying those rules, if an AI system generates something, let's say an image for now, that is substantially similar on its face to an existing copyright protected work, then if that work was in the data set, that's probably enough for us to say, okay, there's a causal connection, there's access to the original, and so we think that the similarity is a result of having access and therefore having copied the original work in the training input. I'm perfectly prepared to say that that results in infringement when you have those pieces and you can put them together. And I actually think in some ways it might be easier to prove infringement in this context because it would be possible to go back to work out what was the data set, or at least not everything in it, but was this work in it, or was this work probably in it? Because, it's a balance of probabilities test anyway. And then we would be able to reach an answer. It's never easy to answer these questions, even in the real world, right? Even if you take AI out of it, did a person happen to have heard this song once when they were a child growing up, and that's why their song that they wrote now sounds similar? I mean, these are all just questions of fact that we try our best to answer in copyright law. And they're never easy to answer, but they're answerable, and I don't think that this is any different, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think like you say, one of the most problematic issues is transparency in the training data sets. Like the copyright holders don't have access most to the data sets that were ingested into these AI systems, which makes it a bit difficult to then prove that it has generated this not due to its some kind of course prompting, but because there was an existing substantially similar aspect that's been used. I think others also have been voicing issues such as tech companies using narrow data sets, it's very technical, but they just said it must not be such kind of broad things. But let's say, what would you advise potential AI tech companies who want to come maybe, in the developing countries, or, how should they walk this path, to avoid, of course, liability, to have a word or so?
Well, so are you thinking still about the outputs, or are you thinking about the inputs as well? I mean, so I'm not a technologist, and I'm not, but I'm fairly confident that there are good technological solutions to making sure that the outputs aren't overly similar to any particular thing within the inputs. And so I understand anyway that it would be possible to put up sort of technological guardrails that make sure that if an output is a certain match with something that's in the training data set, that would be blocked. Right? Like that would be, ideally that's what you do. You'd have an additional kind of process at the back end that would make sure that nothing, that the AI is doing what it's supposed to do, which is generate something new based upon all of the inputs and the learning that it's done in response to prompts. So if it generates something that's not new but is actually substantially similar to any particular thing in the data set, then that would be something that should probably be caught by the system. So I think that there are ways to avoid liability at that end, that you've done everything you can to ensure that the model is not producing infringing content, and that you're business model and the value that you're getting from offering the tool is not based upon the production of infringing content, but based upon the production of non-infringing content, right? So that, to me, if you've got a technology whose primary use is the production of non-infringing content, and they've done what they can to ensure that it's not used for infringing purposes, then that's all we've ever really asked of any sort of technology provider as an intermediary in the marketplace. And I think that would be appropriate to ask in this context as well.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that, insightful a point of view. So my next question to you now will be, let's say in a substantially similar output has been made, like we mentioned, there are supposed to be mechanisms to ensure that that doesn't happen. Let's say it does happen. Who do you think, is likely to be liable? Is it, can you absolve the AI user, or can you absolve the tech company, the AI tech giant? Like on whose hands? I know in China recently they did impute it on a company, and the companies are named, but they held the company liable for producing a substantially similar work. So what's your take, for the world and for Africa and for our lovely viewers behind the screen?
So I would say, as I was saying about the tech provider, in Canada our concept is enabling infringement. So if you have, and it's similar to contributory infringement in the US, if you have an intermediary who again is actually sort of by design intending to, or at least making money from infringing activity at the output stage again, then I think there's potential for liability there. It really depends upon the business model. It depends upon whether they can show that they've done what they can to avoid the technology from producing infringing outputs. But the question about the user, I think, is a good one. And I can imagine, again, I would just work through the applicable laws and look at the person using the technology. Are they trying to get it to reproduce something that would be an infringing copy, right? And if the prompts are used in order basically to get as close as possible to something that would be an infringing copy, then I can imagine that you really do have that kind of and sort of necessary control over the output that you've generated and the way in which you've used it, that it could amount to liability. If, however, you've just put in your prompts and the machine has given you an output and you like it, then it's really hard to say that would be or should be infringing on the part of the user. It's tricky though, right? Because copyright law is not a knowledge-based system, right? Like if you produce an infringing copy and you didn't know it was infringing, we don't care, right? Like it's not about knowledge, it's not about intent. But it is about, you do have to have sufficient sort of control that the production is that you caused it in some way. There's got to be a volitional act in there. And so I actually think it's maybe a mistake to focus upon whether the user happens to have ended up generating an image using the AI tool that is an infringing copy, for example, something in the training data. The question is really going to be, what do they do with that thing? Like if you get multiple options on your screen and you're just sitting at home playing with it, then obviously it's not the kind of thing that should matter. But if you then make your selection, you distribute it, you share it, or you commercialize it, and then we do start caring about knowledge. Did you know that it was an infringing copy? What I've suggested in the context of the Canadian copyright consultations is that there's a little hole there we might want to plug where right now it might not be an infringing copy if it wasn't made by a person. And so I can imagine saying, if it would be an infringing copy if it had been made by a person, then to do something with that copy, like to distribute it or sell it, that could trigger secondary liability with knowledge.
That was very insightful. Thank you so much. But now I do have one and hopefully the last question for you. Do you think the current copyright regime does deal with all the AI and copyright issue, or we need some certain amendments or a total creation of a new regime. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that our current copyright regime does provide most of the answers that we need for generative AI and for the development of AI in general. Which is to say that the answers I've given you so far about what constitutes infringement and does not at the input stage, at the output stage, the answers about what constitutes authorship and does not. These are answers that are, drawing on the copyright law as it is, basically the international copyright system that we have. And so I think copyright can provide those answers. But as I've suggested, I don't think copyright is particularly implicated at the training stage at all. I don't think it's any differently implicated at the output stage than it would be for any artistic output. And I don't think that copyright is the appropriate tool for regulating AI in general. So I think that basically copyright law doesn't have that much of a role to play here, right? It's not protecting the outputs, the inputs are not infringing according to my model. But that's not to say that I think AI doesn't need to be regulated. I share many of the concerns that we hear expressed about this sort of massive proliferation of AI tools, the way that they're being built into all of the systems that we're using, the way that they threaten to change our cultural landscape, to substitute for human authored works, concerns about privacy, concerns about data sovereignty. I think all of these are very important, vital concerns that we need to turn our attention to. And I think copyright law here is actually a bit of a red herring or a distraction. And I think it's tempting to turn to copyright law for the answers. It's a very blunt tool. It's something that we already have. And of course, it's something that the big industry players and the market incumbents are very used to dealing with. They have their copyright lawyers. They will be fine if we decide that they need copyright clearance or they need to pay or compensate for the use of materials and training data. The big players are going to be fine. So I wanted just to mention that I'm working on a new paper now called The AI Copyright Trap. It's forthcoming in the Chicago-Kent Law Review. And I'm calling it a copyright trap because I think it's kind of an enticing regulatory response to run towards copyright as the solution in this context. And I'm cautioning that whereas that would be fine for the big players, it's actually the people who are most drawn towards copyright law who are likely not to benefit from that and actually be harmed by a use of copyright as a regulatory response here, right? So we talk about ownership and property. We imagine that everything has to be propertized. If something is valuable, it must be owned by somebody. That's one way into the copyright trap. Another way is thinking about the trope of the starving or struggling artist and thinking that copyright law is going to be the thing that helps to adequately fund the arts, the thing that actually helps artists to make a living wage. Copyright law has never been good at doing that. It doesn't do that well. And so this is a sort of trope that gets dusted off and used as sort of a political ploy, really, to strengthen copyright law. But it's the industry actors and the market incumbents that benefit from the strengthening of copyright law, not the artists, not the creatives, and not the public. And so I think in this regard, once again, we're seeing people being drawn into a copyright trap where they're imagining that, or believing, or trying to convince us that copyright is the right answer to this. I think it's going to be ultimately counterproductive and problematic because I think, in fact, what we'll be doing is propertizing and commoditizing data. So that only the most powerful players will be able to license it, afford it, and use it. And we're going to end up with an AI space where there's not adequate competition, where there's probably not adequate regulation because we think all we need is copyright law and clearance for rights, and then you can do what you want. And so in fact, we're going to lose sight of the real harms that are being presented by AI, and it's going to be a lack of imagination in terms of what the real regulatory responses should be to ensure that we have ethical, responsible AI that's developed in the public interest.
Thank you so much. No, that was a very interesting observation. The fact that this AI copyright is a red herring. It's just there, being employed as a ploy, of course, to get, our eyes and attention focused on copyright and then negate, all the other essential aspects like privacy and also data sovereignty. So thank you so much, Prof, once again for joining us. And I very much appreciate you taking time and being with us. And to our lovely viewers, thank you so much for staying with us. And the crew behind the scenes, we appreciate you for doing a wonderful job. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you.